Silence isn't confusion. It's a calculated move. And the moment you understand that, something shifts inside you. Something that had been quietly breaking for a long time begins, slowly, to make sense. Because you have been here before. You have sat with the weight of something that happened, turning it over in your mind, asking yourself if you imagined it. Asking yourself if you were too sensitive, too emotional, too much, and the person who hurt you, they seemed completely fine, at peace even, moving through their days without any visible sign that something had occurred between you. No guilt visible on their face, no hesitation in their voice, just nothing, as if what happened lived only inside you, and that absence of reaction was more confusing than anything else. Because you thought, if they had truly done something wrong, they would know. They would show it. They would say something. But here is the psychological truth that most people spend years learning the hard way. People who hurt you almost always know exactly what they did. The silence is not confusion. The distance is not forgetting. The peace on their face is not innocence. It is management. They are not confused about what happened. They are managing what they allow themselves to feel about it. And understanding the difference between those two things will change how you relate to yourself and to the people around you for the rest of your life. Think about a moment most people recognize, a conversation that starts normally, a dinner table, an office, a group chat, people talking the way they always do, comfortable, familiar. And then one person says something honest, not aggressive, not cruel, just honest. They name something that had been quietly true for a long time, but that everyone had silently agreed not to name. Maybe they said, "This doesn't feel fair." Maybe they said, "I've been feeling left out." Maybe they said, "I need you to stop doing that." Simple sentences, true sentences. And the room does something subtle. It doesn't explode. It doesn't argue. It just shifts. The warmth changes slightly. Someone looks at their plate. Someone picks up their phone. A joke is made that steers the conversation somewhere else. And the person who spoke honestly can feel it. They feel it in their chest before they can explain it. A strange contraction, the sense that they made a mistake, but cannot figure out what the mistake was, because nothing was said back. No one disagreed with them openly. No one told them they were wrong. They were just managed, rerouted, quietly dismissed. And they go home that night asking themselves if they should have stayed quiet. If speaking the truth was a mistake. If the discomfort they created was their fault. This is where the damage truly begins, not in the moment of hurt, but in the silence that follows it, in the way the person who was wronged begins to doubt themselves, while the person who caused the wrong goes back to their evening, undisturbed. Now here is where most people get it wrong. They assume that when someone causes harm and shows no sign of remorse, it means they genuinely do not know, that they are unaware, that they simply do not understand the impact of what they did. It is a generous assumption. It is also, in most cases, incorrect. The psychological literature on interpersonal harm has produced findings that the general public rarely hears. People are far more aware of their own behavior than they let on. There is a concept in social psychology called moral disengagement. It was developed by the psychologist Albert Bandura, and it describes the mental strategies people use to continue behaving in ways that violate their own values without experiencing the full weight of guilt. In other words, people who hurt others do not lose the ability to feel guilt. They develop the ability to suppress it, to redirect it, to reframe it. They tell themselves a story in which they are not the one who caused harm, in which you are the one who overreacted, in which the problem is your sensitivity, not their behavior. And they repeat that story until it becomes their reality. But underneath it, on a level they are rarely willing to look at directly, they know. Jung called it the shadow. The part of the psyche that holds everything a person refuses to integrate, everything they have done that they cannot accept as being part of who they are. The shadow does not disappear when you refuse to look at it. It simply goes underground. It drives behavior from below the surface. It shows up in projection, in irritability, in the need to make others responsible for what they themselves have caused. When someone hurts you and then insists they did nothing, they are often not lying to you. They are lying to themselves. And they have been doing it long enough that the two have become indistinguishable. This is not an excuse. This is an explanation. And understanding it is not about forgiving them. It is about finally, clearly Understanding what you were actually dealing with. Point 1. Their peace is performed, not real. There is something that happens in people who cause harm and walk away without accountability. On the outside, they appear unbothered. They continue their lives. They laugh at things. They sleep at night. They do not seem to carry what happened. And this, more than almost anything else, can make the person they hurt feel like they are losing their mind. Because you are carrying it. You are the one lying awake reconstructing what was said. You are the one with the weight of it sitting in your body. And they seem fine. But here is what psychology tells us about this kind of peace. It is not the peace that comes from having done nothing wrong. It is the peace that comes from having worked very hard not to feel the thing that would confirm they did. There is a difference between someone who has processed an event and arrived at genuine peace, and someone who has simply buried the event under enough distraction, denial, and narrative revision that it no longer surfaces. One of those people is at rest. The other is maintaining. And maintenance is exhausting, even when it does not look like it. The research on suppressed guilt is clear. It does not disappear from the nervous system. It transforms. It becomes irritability. It becomes the strange defensiveness that appears when the subject comes close. It becomes the excessive need to be seen as a good person. People who have genuinely done nothing wrong rarely need to insist on their innocence with the intensity of those who have. Remember that the next time someone's peace looks a little too performed. Point 2. The story they tell about you tells you everything. After someone causes harm, they have a problem. The problem is that the facts of what happened do not support the image they hold of themselves. And so the facts must be adjusted. Not necessarily through lying, though that happens too. More often through reframing. Suddenly, you are described as unstable, as someone who overreacts to small things, as someone who is difficult to communicate with, as someone with a lot of unresolved issues. They may not say any of this directly. They may simply let it be implied. A raised eyebrow when your name comes up. A comment that lands just heavy enough to shift how mutual friends see you. A careful suggestion that you are the kind of person who struggles. This is not accidental. This is moral disengagement in practice. This is a person constructing a version of events in which they are reasonable and you are the problem. And here is the part that is hardest to hold. They often believe it, not entirely, but enough to function, enough to look people in the eye, enough to sleep. Jung said that what we refuse to see in ourselves, we project onto others. When a person who has caused harm begins to describe you as dramatic, unstable, or difficult, ask yourself what they are refusing to see in themselves that they have placed onto you. Because the story they tell about you is rarely about you. It is a mirror they have turned outward to avoid having to look inward. Point 3. They did not miss the signals. They chose to ignore them. Here is what people often say after being hurt. They just didn't realize how much they were hurting me. And sometimes that is true. Sometimes someone genuinely lacks the emotional attunement to see impact. But in the cases that stay with us, in the relationships that leave the deepest marks, the person usually knew. They saw you pull back. They noticed when you stopped bringing up certain topics. They felt the silence grow. They registered the change in your face. But reading the signal clearly would require them to respond to it. And responding to it would require them to acknowledge something about what they were doing. So instead, they chose not to notice. This is not a passive failure of awareness. This is an active choice made quickly and repeated consistently. The choice to not notice, the choice to not ask, the choice to let the silence accumulate rather than step into the discomfort of having to examine their own behavior. Nietzsche wrote about the will to power in a way most people misunderstand. He was not describing the desire to dominate others. He was describing the will to master oneself. The willingness to face the parts of yourself that are uncomfortable and move through them rather than around them. Most people never develop that will. Most people find it far easier to let others carry the weight of what they themselves have caused. When someone chose not to notice what they were doing to you, they were choosing the easy path. And you, by continuing to feel it, to name it, to refuse to pretend, were choosing the harder one. Point 4. The gaslighting was strategic, not accidental. There is a moment in many harmful relationships where the person who was hurt begins to question their own reality, where they start to say, maybe I misremembered, Maybe that conversation did not happen the way I think it did. Maybe I am the one who caused this. This does not happen by accident. Gaslighting in its most common form is not always a calculated, deliberate plan of manipulation. Sometimes it is, but more often it is a pattern that develops because the person causing harm realizes, consciously or not, that destabilizing your perception of events protects them from having to account for those events. When you say, "This happened," and they say, "That is not what happened," and then you say, "But I was there," and they say, "You always do this," there is a subtle but decisive shift taking place. The conversation is no longer about the event. The conversation is now about your reliability as a witness. And once they have moved you to that ground, they are on much safer territory. Because now the question is not what they did. The question is whether you can be trusted to accurately report what you experienced. This is one of the most psychologically precise forms of harm a person can cause. And it is most effective on people who are already inclined to doubt themselves. On people who were taught that their feelings were too much. On people who learned early that peace in the room required them to be quiet. If you have experienced this, there is something you need to hear clearly. The fact that they made you doubt yourself does not mean your perception was wrong. It means they had something to protect. Point 5. Their accountability would cost them more than your pain cost you. This is perhaps the most clarifying idea in this entire conversation. When someone refuses accountability, it is rarely because they lack the moral awareness to understand what they did. It is because the cost of accountability exceeds what they are willing to pay. Accountability, real accountability, requires admitting to yourself that you caused harm, sitting with the discomfort of that truth, allowing yourself to feel the guilt fully, changing something in your behavior, risking how other people see you, potentially losing something, status, a relationship, a self-image. For many people, that price is simply too high. And so instead, they choose to let you carry what is rightfully theirs. They let your pain be the price of their comfort. They let your confusion be the cost of their self-image. They let your doubt be what protects their certainty. And the cruelest part is, this works. Because empathetic people, people who feel things deeply, people who are wired for connection and care, will almost always attempt to carry weight that is not theirs. They will try to understand. They will make room for context. They will wonder if they ask too much. And in doing so, they relieve the other person of the discomfort that should have been the catalyst for growth. Understanding this is not about becoming cold. It is about understanding the mechanism, so that the next time you feel the weight of something that is not yours, you can name what is happening instead of picking it up. Point 6. Silence became their greatest tool. Not every form of harm is delivered through words. Some of the most precise and lasting damage is delivered through silence, through the absence of a response, through the look that passes over you as though you are not in the room, through the explanation never given, through the apology withheld in precisely the way that communicates not confusion but contempt. Silence, in the hands of someone who knows how to use it, is a form of communication. It says, "You are not worth addressing." It says, "Your reality does not require acknowledgement." It says, "I can determine your value by the quality of my attention toward you." And it is particularly effective because it leaves the person on the receiving end with nothing to respond to. You cannot argue against silence. You cannot prove that a non-response meant something. You cannot defend yourself against an absence. And so you are left to fill the silence yourself, with explanations that protect them, with interpretations that excuse them, with doubt that erases you. This is not an accident. Machiavelli understood centuries ago that control does not always require action. Sometimes the most powerful move is to simply withhold, to make someone uncertain, to keep them working for something you have no intention of giving. The silence you experienced was not neutral. It was a choice. It told you something true about how you were being held in that relationship. And that truth, as painful as it is more useful to you than the comfortable lies the silence was designed to produce. The price of seeing clearly. Here is where it becomes important to be honest. Understanding all of this comes at a cost, because once you see these mechanisms clearly, you cannot unsee them. Once you understand that someone's silence was strategic, the relationship you thought you had is revealed to be something different. Once you understand that the story they told about you was a mirror turned outward, The loss of that friendship, that relationship, that family dynamic becomes real in a way it was not before. Because before you could tell yourself it was a misunderstanding. You could tell yourself that with enough explanation, enough patience, enough effort, things could be different. But clarity takes that comfort away, and that grief is real. It is not weakness to mourn a relationship that turned out to be less than you believed. It is not oversensitivity to feel the loss of a version of someone you needed to believe in. Some of these losses will truly hurt, not because you were wrong to see what you saw, but because seeing clearly does not make the feeling any less sharp. There will be people who call you cold, who say you changed, who suggest that the version of you who asked no questions and accepted what was given was easier to be around. They will be right. That version was easier for them. And there will be loneliness in the clarity. A particular kind of loneliness that comes from understanding something that the people around you have collectively decided not to understand. You may sit in rooms where everyone else is performing normalcy and feel the weight of what you can no longer pretend not to see. That weight is not a sign that something is wrong with you. That weight is the cost of having developed a perception that most people never fully develop. Carry it carefully, but carry it. What you become on the other side. There is something that happens to a person who has been through this and decided to stay honest with themselves, not in an aggressive way, not with bitterness, not with the kind of hardness that closes everything, but with a quiet, settled clarity that changes everything about how they move through the world. They become harder to destabilize, not because they feel less, but because they no longer need the version of events that requires their own disappearance. They stop carrying weight that was never theirs, not with a speech, not with a confrontation, simply by no longer bending to receive it. They become more selective, not because they distrust everyone, but because they have learned to read the small signals, the silence that lasts a half second too long, the change in tone when a certain subject comes close, the way someone's peace becomes just slightly too insisted upon. They learn to trust what they notice, because for a long time they were taught not to. Because for a long time, the cost of trusting their own perception was social, was warmth, was belonging. And they paid that cost by doubting themselves until the doubt became heavier than the belonging was worth. What they become on the other side of that is not invulnerable. They still feel. They still want connection. They still care about the people in their lives. But they care from a different place. Not from fear of loss. Not from the need to be accepted. Not from the old role that required their silence to function. From genuine choice. And that shift, from people-pleasing rooted in fear to connection rooted in self-respect, is quiet. Most people around them will not even notice it happened, but they will feel it. In the way they no longer apologize for noticing things. In the way they can sit in an uncomfortable silence without rushing to fill it with reassurance. In the way they respond to cruelty, not with rage and not with collapse, but with a still clear recognition. That is about them, not about me. That is the transformation, not a performance, not a lesson taught to others. Just a quiet internal alignment between what you see and what you are willing to act on. What you need to hear at the end. Come back to where this started, the confusion, the silence. The moment you kept replaying, wondering if you had imagined it. The weight you carried that was never explained to you. You did not imagine it. You were not too sensitive. You were not overreacting. You were not the problem. You were noticing something real in a space where the unspoken agreement was that real things should go unnoticed. And that noticing, that refusal to make yourself smaller than the truth, was not a mistake. It was the beginning of something. The people who hurt you knew what they did. They knew in the moment. They knew in the silence that followed. They knew every time they rewrote the story to protect themselves from knowing. Their peace was not proof of your mistake. Their peace was proof of their management. And you, in all your grief and confusion and self-questioning, were closer to the truth than any of them were willing to be. The pain you felt was real. The thing you noticed was real. The cost you paid for refusing to look away was real. And the clarity you have now, the understanding that you are building, belongs to you. Not because it erases what happened, but because it means they can no longer use your doubt against you. The moment you stop needing them to admit what they did in order to trust what you experienced, They lose the last piece of control they had. You were not losing people. You were losing roles you were never meant to keep. And the silence that once carried weight becomes, finally, just silence.